Good morning. I've just turned my phone to silent. Okay. We all appreciate the benefits and downsides of disruptive technology. Masterclass speaker, Professor Diana Laurillard, our guest of honor, Vice Provost, Professor Bernard Chan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to the NUS Teaching Academy's third Masterclass Public Lecture. The Teaching Academy, as many of you will know, was conceived in 2009 with a vision to pursue excellence in educational innovation and to foster a balanced culture of education and research. It has now established itself as an authentic voice for NUS educators, engaging the broader academic community through various initiatives, channeling feedback to senior management on educational matters, and exploring new ideas on education. The Academy, in addition to its many activities, has two flagship events: an annual Distinguished Lecture and Workshop, which we hold in May, and a biennial Masterclass Week, which we hold in September. Today's event, the public lecture, is the highlight of what will be a week-long series of events, including this lecture, a Masterclass workshop on Thursday, two open discussion sessions, one on Wednesday and one on Friday, as well as a roundtable with senior management later today. So throughout this week, we hope to invigorate the academic community at NUS with fresh ideas on how to improve teaching and learning, as well as to imagine the future of higher education in the digital world. We are privileged to have as our Masterclass speaker this year, Professor Diana Laurillard, Professor of Learning with Digital Technologies at University College London Knowledge Lab, Institute of Education. Now, prior to her appointment at the UCL Institute of Education, Diana was head of the e-learning strategy unit at the UK Government Department for Education and Skills, and served as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Learning Technologies and Teaching at the Open University. She served as the President of the Association for Learning Technology and was a founding member of the Visiting Committee on IT at Harvard University and of the Center for Educational Neuroscience at the University of London. Formerly on the boards of the UNESCO Institute for IT in Education, the Fern Universität in Germany, and the Observatory for Borderless Higher Education, Diana is now on the board of the Learning Foundation and the Education Advisory Board for Climate KIC, Knowledge and Innovation Community. She's also working on several projects around MOOCs and blended learning and is collaborating with the Beijing Normal University's Advanced Innovation Center for the Future of Education, as well as the Learning Sciences Lab, National Institute for Education, Singapore. Diana's lecture today is entitled Future of Higher Education in the Digital World, in which she will present and comment on the threats and opportunities that the digital world presents to higher education. This is an issue that is close to the hearts and minds of the leaders at NUS and the Singapore government, and indeed around the world. How do we use technology as a tool to enhance education? And perhaps more importantly, how do we reconceptualize higher education to prepare students for the digital world of the future? I had the pleasure of interacting with Diana yesterday over two brief sessions with Academy Fellows, during which several interesting questions were raised, many of which I hope will continue to be debated over this week. But for now, it is my great pleasure to invite Professor Diana Laurillard to deliver the third NUS Teaching Academy Masterclass Public Lecture, Future of Higher Education in the Digital World. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first, I want to thank my hosts for their very kind invitation to come and join you for this masterclass session. Professor Kumara Lingam and colleagues at NUS. It's really a great honor to be able to do this. And I have to say a great pleasure as well, because every time I come to Singapore, I'm delighted by the seriousness with which you attack the problems in education and constantly looking for innovative ways and better ways to do what we're all trying to do. So it's always a joy to work here, and I very much look forward to the opportunity of this that this week holds, already having some stimulating discussions yesterday. So we've got this challenging idea of the future of higher education in the digital world, and I want to just give you a sense of the direction in which I'm going to try and take this. First of all, I think it's fair to say that digital technologies create both threats and opportunities for higher education. But if we maintain our own secure understanding of what the aims and purposes of higher education are, then we should be in a good position to defend ourselves against the threats and also optimize these great new opportunities. And I'm going to look in particular at what you might call an internal orientation to how we deal with the digital world, what we do within the university, and an external orientation to how we change what we do in order to interact with this changing world. So part of this is to think about helping the individual to reach their learning potential. Part of it is about building knowledge more rapidly, in the context of research especially. Thirdly, adapting to the changing demands of the economy, because our economies are constantly changing and that is becoming even more rapid. And we like to think of ourselves as having a moderately leisurely pace of change within higher education because it takes a long time to understand things. Research has to work hard. You can't do that overnight. But the world changes overnight. So it's very difficult for us to adapt and respond to these constantly changing demands around us. And finally, achieving genuinely global prosperity. That's an issue which I think has to concern all of us. In an ever more unequal world, we surely have a role to play here. So what kinds of differences might we make? Well, I think I'm going to follow each of these lines of thought with one thread of one of the ways in which digital technologies might make a difference. So in thinking about helping the individual, clearly that the opportunities that we have from personalized learning are going to make a difference there. Building knowledge more rapidly, we have more opportunities to link research and teaching together. Something we've always talked about in our rhetoric in higher education, but it's actually been quite hard to do. And I want to talk about a couple of ways in which we're trying to do that. Adapting to the changing demands of our economies, that means we have to be much more productive in the way in which we operate within universities. So I want to pay a bit of attention to that and how technologies can help us with that. Achieving genuinely inclusive prosperity via broader access to higher education, that surely has to be one of our foci. And overall, I think I'm doing this in the context of a belief which I'm sure I share with absolutely everybody in this room, that education is critical for building a better world. We're in the building which is dedicated to Li Kongqian, who said education is so fundamentally important as the basis for prosperity in our world, in our state. And that, I think, we must all share that belief. What you may not be quite so convinced of is that digital technology is the means by which we do this on the large scale. And that's my job to try and convince you that this is actually possible for us to do. Okay, so I talked about threats and opportunities, and I think some of the threats are real. They've been with us for quite some time. The idea that there are disruptive technologies and these can really change what we're doing in higher education. Private providers are always threatening to come and take over what we do in higher education. But nonetheless, we seem to survive and carry on. Unregulated systems are there all the time, and we don't have clear ways of always being able to defend ourselves against the predations of private industry. But when we think that it was something like 20 years ago when the internet first started really being used extensively by people, and there were dire predictions that this could mean the end of higher education, because anybody can get hold of anything they want now on the internet, they can find their way, they can pick and choose. And then about 10 years ago, there was the rise of e-universities, and everybody was saying this is the way of the future, and they will take over from higher education. Higher education can't adapt fast enough. And I was beginning to worry by that time, because I thought the private sector is very good at innovation, it's very good at investment, and it's very good at picking and choosing the low-hanging fruit of what it goes after, and it could very easily find ways of disrupting higher education. But it carried on with e-learning universities developing. The one that was developed within the UK crashed before it even started, but others lasted a little longer. But they haven't disrupted what we're all doing. They haven't changed what's happening in global higher education. Then about 5 years ago, MOOCs came along, and everybody was again predicting doom and gloom for higher education, and this is now the way of the future, and we can do higher education on the mass scale. Well, no, we couldn't. And I think we've been fortunate because it's clear that the private sector does not understand the nature of the education industry. And I don't mind calling it an industry and universities businesses, because they're useful analogies, but you can only take analogies so far. And the mistake that I think the private sector has made is to see education as being a mass delivery industry. They see it as being rather like Amazon. You can deliver knowledge to your door, and they can do all sorts of innovative things with communications technology, so we can have everybody picking and choosing what they like on the internet. What they don't understand is that higher education is actually a client industry. And it's not like Amazon, and it's not like other kinds of mass production industry. It's much more like, you might say, like being a lawyer or being an accountant or, I don't know, a hairdresser. I don't know quite how far we can take this analogy, but I mean, it's what we think about when we think about education is we are changing minds, individual minds. And that means a very personal relationship with that individual of who they are, what their ambition is, where they want to go, and how we help them do that. And you can't do that on the mass scale in the way that private industry thinks you can. So they are still failing. However, because the private sector is innovative, can invest, and can actually pick off the easy bits of higher education, I'm pretty sure they will find a way to succeed sooner or later, as soon as they start understanding what education is. So it's incumbent on us still to think about what can we do with the digital tools which are now available, with digital resources and digital services for improving access to higher education. What can we do? Now, when we start thinking about these difficult ideas, I think it's very important that we have a kind of anchor, a foundation on which to think. And in terms of higher education, we've got to be thinking about the future in terms of what is the real purpose of higher education? And about 20 years ago, I had the good fortune to be involved in a UK government initiative to have a national inquiry on higher education. This was the first time they'd done this since the early 60s. I don't know if anybody in this room remembers the Robbins report in the early 60s, but it was very important for saying we need to open up higher education to far more people. And so they created half a dozen new universities, a very important development. Well, nothing had really happened on that scale until the mid-90s. It was about 1996, just before the new Labour government came in. And they decided to have this committee of inquiry. And I was on it, along with a lot of vice-chancellors and the great and the good. I think I was a kind of token woman. I think that was part of the reason. And also I think I was token expert on distance learning because I was teaching at the Open University at the time and nobody else knew anything about distance learning. And I think I was also token learning technologist because nobody knew anything about how to deal with digital technology. So I had the good fortune to be on this committee of inquiry. And the first thing we were tasked with was to think about the aims and purposes of higher education. Back in the 60s, what the Robbins report had done was to do the same kind of analysis and say there are 4 things that higher education does. It's for the individual, inspiring the individual. It's for research, developing knowledge. It's for the economy, extending the economy. And it's for society, improving society. So they said, forget all that, do your own analysis. And so we spent weeks doing consultation and debating and ideas and looking at the data and so on and deciding what the fundamental aims and purposes of higher education were. And we came up with 4. And we said it was about the individual, about knowledge, about economy, and about society. And this was, I mean, we didn't waste those weeks, I don't think. I think what was important about that was that we were secure in the knowledge and understanding that this is fundamentally what higher education is about. It's enduring. This is fundamental to the way in which the nation state operates. So the definition of personal was inspiring individuals to develop their highest potential. The definition of knowledge was to increase knowledge and understanding for the benefit of the economy and society, to serve the needs of an adaptable, sustainable knowledge economy. And the social one was interesting, because although it was there in the same way to serve the needs of society, in the early 60s, the Robbins Report definition was to transmit a common culture. Now, by the time we got to the mid-90s, there was no way we could say that. We were a multicultural society. We were not leaders in the same confident way that we had been before. We were part of a process. So that became to play a major role in shaping a democratic, civilized, and inclusive society. So those precepts, the fundamental anchoring of what we're about, is what we have to bear in mind as we're thinking about, so what is the future, given this new world of digital technology? So this is the route that I want to take this argument, beginning with the fact of digital technologies. We have apparent threats, we have apparent opportunities. Higher education is in that mix, and we have the power to reduce the threats and the power to increase the opportunities if we operate the right way with respect to this. So what I'm going to suggest is that there are these 4 ways in which we can think about this. Thinking about the individual, what can we do to help individuals reach their learning potential? And I'm going to focus on personalized learning. Thinking about what we can do in the field of research and building knowledge, I'm going to focus on the link between research and teaching that is now much more powerful than it has been before. In terms of serving the economy, how can we become more adaptive and quicker to respond to the demands of the economy? We have to become more productive in the way that we operate. And I'm going to talk about ways of using technology to do that. And finally, achieving genuinely inclusive prosperity. How do we do that? Broader access to higher education must surely be one of our goals. So we have 2 kind of internal orientations with the way we help students and the way we link teaching and research, and 2 external orientations towards the economy and towards society. So to begin with, individuals reaching their learning potential. So we're in this part of the diagram here, where we're looking at those kinds of opportunities. And as we think about personalized learning, this is clearly something which computing can do, because we all have our individual devices now. So there are ways in which we can help students on an individual level. But there are many different kinds of students. And one of the things we have to grapple with is this great diversity in our student population. So let's think about the top achiever, the person who can and needs to be stretched. Then the student who can do better, who's maybe cruising along a bit and could be pushed, needs to be motivated. The learner who has a core disability, no fault of their own, but needs help and otherwise will be undervalued and not anywhere near achieve their potential in education. And then the learner whom the system repeatedly fails, in both senses of that word. They fail and we fail. When we fail to get students to understand what they could do in the context of education, they turn away from it, they turn their backs on it. What can we do with those learners? And then the typical student, what can we do for them? So for the top achiever, maybe something like applying the concepts which they're currently learning, but to more complex situations, finding ways in which we can stretch them. The student who could do better, getting them to understand in terms of the feedback they can get on their current performance in relation to what it could be. The learner who has a core disability, I'm going to look at things like self-regulated learning games. We don't use enough in terms of games within the context of education. And the student who repeatedly fails, can we look at rewards for small successes? And a typical student, well, I'll come to that. So what I'm doing here is just picking off some particular areas in which digital technologies can do something which nothing else can do. that makes an important difference in those particular kinds of areas. So one example of stretching someone is being able to use some of the extraordinary resources out there on the internet. And this is a nice one. And in all of these slides, I've got links to the resources and papers and so on that I'm talking about. So I'd be very happy if you could go and look at this, because it's kind of fun to look at. It gives you the opportunity to look at how asteroids in their rotation can be tracked and understood for the nature of what they're doing. And if you look at the waveform that they're generating, you can help to identify the motion of that asteroid. So you're making some kind of contribution when you find something in the sky to understanding what kind of motion that asteroid has. So it's just a little simulation of how you would interpret this. You have to interpret the waveform as it's moving along. And these asteroids underneath are all rotating, and you pick one of them you think is right, and then it explains why it's right or wrong. So for that student who has gone beyond what you're already doing in that kind of area of physics, there are some interesting things out there. Look at the NASA website, has some wonderful educational resources, and see if you can stretch your students by giving them something a bit harder than is normally in the normal curriculum. So there are lots of ways in which they can do that, and even using your own students to go and find some of those resources and share them with each other can be another way of stretching their powers. Actually, I think this could be done a lot better, because this is a multiple choice question, and one of the things that universities could do as they interact with the NASA educational resources is say, you could do this, design this even better if you like, we'll work with you to do that. Wouldn't that be a great project to stretch a top student, to improve the way in which people could interact with models of that kind? So there's lots of ways in which we can use digital technologies to take our top students beyond what we can really comfortably do within our own courses. Then thinking about the student who is not doing as well as they should. Now, we all know about learning analytics and the kind of information that can come back from digital transactions to the lecturer, so they can understand where their students are, how well they're performing. But this is a project which is giving the students access to that data. So it's showing them this kind of VLE activity. They can compare where they are with other students, and so it's plotting the kind of relationship between your activity and those who are getting A, B, and C grades are nearly twice as likely to go to this tool to check their progress as those who are not. Students with D or F grades use the VLE 40% less than those with the A, B, and C grades. So you can see the green activity is what's leading to you to a top and a higher grade, and the red activity is what's leading you towards a D or an F grade. Now, if you're a student who's plotting your way through this, and you were to see your personal grade line, activity line, you can see, if it's coming out like that, you're heading fairly inexorably for a D or an F grade. If you're a student whose track looks like that, it looks as though you're pretty well up there in the green, but you could be dropping down, if you're not very careful, towards the red. So you've got to buck up your ideas and make sure that you stay up in that green area. So for the individual student, it's almost like biofeedback, and the motivation to do a bit more work, to get up there into the A, B, and C grade on a week-by-week basis must surely help those students move a bit faster. And that's why they see year after year that those students who are using it less, don't even see this, are not getting those higher grades. Now, whether you force your students to see how well they're doing, or whether you encourage them to, or whether you check whether they're doing it or not, that's up to your individual policy. But that kind of feedback tool to the learner on their current performance in relation to others, showing them where their trajectory is leading them, that's so important for enabling them to stay on track, to understand what it takes to be able to get the higher grades they really want. Because too many students are deluded about how much work it really takes, and that's one of the things that enables them to see. So we should be doing more of that kind of thing to help them do that. Then another kind of approach to using digital technology is looking at what it takes to help students with a disability. And one project we've been working on is dyscalculia, which is a bit like dyslexia, but much less well understood, and relates to an understanding of number. And so people who are dyscalculic find it very hard to understand how numbers relate to each other. I can best give you the illustration by saying that if you ask someone who is dyscalculic, and this is a deficiency in the brain, just as dyslexia is, usually inherited, and it persists throughout life. So this is why it's just as important for higher education to understand this as it is to understand what dyslexia means. So what it means is that they find it very hard, although they can count, they can recite the counting sequence, they don't understand the internal relations between numbers. So if you ask a dyscalculic person, for example, to count down from 10 in ones, they'll go 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They can do it by counting, but they don't automatically see that relationship. And the best analogy I can think of for that is how I would react if somebody asked me to recite the alphabet backwards from the letter V or something. And I would go P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, U, T. And I would find it quite hard, but I would do it exactly the same way. And that's because there's no relationship between those letters. If you ask me what's the relationship between L and P, I'd say, what on earth are you talking about? If you ask me what's the relationship between 9 and 13, I immediately think 4. And it is 4, isn't it? Yes. And it's because we're used to the idea that there's a relationship between numbers. There's no such thing as a relationship between letters. It's just an arbitrary sequence. That's how dyscalculics see number. So imagine how hard arithmetic is. And by the way, this has nothing to do with intelligence. It's not even to do with mathematical ability, because some mathematicians can be dyscalculic. They tend not to work in number theory. They work in geometry or logic or something rather different. But it's a condition that persists throughout life. You can be CEO of a big company and be dyscalculic. It's got nothing to do with intelligence or capability. So in the context of higher education, we've got to understand this, because some students will have, by some trick or other, by very good tuition, have made it through to higher education and still be dyscalculic. And there are many such students within higher education. So what can we do? It's very important to find ways of helping students at a very early age through this issue. Because if we don't, everyone, including themselves, will think they're stupid. And the most important thing for children who are dyscalculic is to be understood to be dyscalculic, to do the tests, and you can test very simply whether they're dyscalculic or not. And then they don't feel stupid anymore. They feel there's a reason. That's so important. And adults will suddenly hear of dyscalculia and suddenly think, oh, thank goodness it's not me. It's a very powerful feeling. So this game comes out of the project in educational neuroscience, where we're using neuroscientists to help us understand what the brain science of dyscalculia is, where it's located in the brain, what kinds of things you can do to change the way in which the brain approaches number, and look at what digital technology can do to enable that processing of the relations between number which those students need. So this is a very simple game where you have to make that target number at the top. And at the beginning, we're just doing things with beads. And we've got sets of beads which you can pull together or split apart. So we're trying to make 4 purple beads. We can split that 2 just by slicing between them. And if you can see that, I know it's a bit hard to see on there, but that 2 is splitting into 2 1s when you split it. So all it does in that case is it just shows you what you've done. It's not saying, no, that's wrong, you haven't made a 4 or anything like that. It's just, in each case, it shows you the result of your action. This is the way the world helps us learn. We try to do something, we try to reach a goal, something happens, and we see the result of that action, and that's what should help us understand how to hit the goal better. So in this case, we're trying to make 4s, and if we succeed in pulling together a couple of 2s, that will turn into a 4, and the student then sees that they've been able to make a 4. And then that gets collected, and then you carry on. There's more things come into the space, and you can cut down 7s, and you can build up 1s, and there's all sorts of ways in which people attack it. But it's just as if you're playing with those numbers and manipulating them in the real world. Then it moves on from just dealing with colored beads to dealing with collections which have a little digit attached to them. Then you lose the help of the color at the next stage, and then you lose the help of the beads, and you're just working with digits. So it's scaffolding them through that process of beginning to understand why 4 and 3 should be 7. Because you've been through all that process of understanding what happens when you pull things together and break them apart. Now, as a means by which we help students do it, we're still in the process of understanding how best to design these things and what kind of impact they have. I've got a tiny little video to show you. It's only lasts about 20 seconds. This is the year 1 week group. There's only, I think, 3 or 4 students in the class, so they're getting a lot of extra help. And lost it. And they're having a go at this game.
You make the best games in the whole world.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I've done it again.
Excellent.
So I'm going to remove this red. Sorry, red, but I need to remove you. I need to remove you. Right?
Okay, so what's happening here is that this group of students
Here and there.
who are normally, it's hard to get them to do any number work at all, remain engrossed in this kind of game for 20 minutes, half an hour, and then you can't drag them away. When I was recently giving a talk about this at a Royal Society conference on educational neuroscience, and I made the mistake when I was talking about this game of putting up the URL to link to it. And within seconds, the entire audience was like this, playing the game, and I'd lost them completely from what I wanted to say. So I haven't made that mistake this time. But I just want to emphasize how valuable it is. You know, we are game players. We love that power and efficacy of trying to do something, not quite getting it, trying again, trying again, trying again. And during a 20-minute session like this, those students are processing something like 180 transactions. Some might be slower than that, but it's quite normal for that to be 180 transactions of doing things. If you look at a typical class, that class, working with a teacher with pencil and paper, doing a group process through working through a calculation, they may get through 3 such problems within 20 minutes. So there's a huge discrepancy between the amount of brain processing activity you need to do in order to get the idea of number combinations and what it takes to do that within a classroom. Digital can really help. So we should be exploring far more of these kinds of things, enabling students to experiment and play. The NASA experiment could be something that would really push people hard, if only it wasn't that multiple choice question. We could do a lot more with that. So at all levels, it's possible to engage people in thinking hard about conceptual ideas and the behavior of conceptual objects in a game context. We haven't done it in education because games are expensive and difficult to make. And the games industry isn't interested because there's no money in it in education, and so they carry on developing more and more complex leisure games. But the power of that process of trying to reach a goal, doing something in order to seeing what happens as a result, not being told you're wrong, but just playing. That's what we need to exploit in order to help those kinds of learners. And then thinking about the learners who just hate education, don't really want to have anything to do with it, have always been told they're failing. So for these students, this is an initiative in vocational education, which has quite a difficulty in getting students to really focus on what they're doing. And this e-portfolio approach with digital badges, this is very small steps. And in the context of vocational education, encouraging students to have that sense of self-efficacy, to really be empowered to come into education and learn, that's extremely important. So one file is a kind of e-portfolio where you build up, I've learned this particular skill, I have evidence for it, and I'm gradually building towards a complete skill. This knife skills, I assure you, is to do with catering only. And they will do different kinds of knife skills and so on. And they each have this representation of their portfolio on their iPhone. So they've got to show evidence, that small green thing down the side. And one way of showing the evidence of your knife skills would be able to show your filleting skills, for example. So students film each other with their iPhones. You have a 20-second representation of how good you are at doing this particular thing. That goes on your portfolio. That's part of your digital CV. That's what you send to an employer. That student will be outstanding in relation to other students applying who don't have that kind of evidence. So already they're finding it's making a difference, even to getting an interview, even to being seen by an employer. But most important for those individual students is those small steps of achievement, of seeing they can do something and they can keep improving. So all of those advantages are around being able to get students more engaged in education, taking more responsibility for their own education, moving themselves forward a step at a time. And again, there's only a digital process can really support that effectively. So to summarize, looking at those different kinds of learners and personalized learning, the top achiever being stretched, the student who could do better, getting feedback on how well they're doing, excuse me, the learner who has a core disability and that can apply to all other kinds of disabilities as well, the student whom the system repeatedly fails, rewarding their small successes. And then what about the typical student? Well, I think the answer is very simple, all of the above. We can all benefit from all of those different kinds of ways in which digital can support individual learning. So we should be exploring those, experimenting with those, seeing the different kinds of ways in which we can use these widespread techniques which are now available to us. And there's a huge plethora of ideas. It's the most exciting thing to happen to education for centuries, I think. Building knowledge more rapidly, and this is looking at the kind of the responsibility higher education has to build ideas, to discover and build research ideas. And there's always been a lot of rhetoric about the importance of linking research and teaching as a way of bringing students more into a research-oriented approach to their study and to their workplace environment when they go out to work. But I think the rhetoric has not really been served as well as it might be by the practice. So we're looking now at ways in which that can be enhanced by using digital technologies. And at University College, we have something called the Connected Curriculum, which has a variety of ways in which we try to help students connect what they're learning about with the research world. So we're connecting research and teaching, for example. We're connecting students to other disciplines in their field. We're connecting students from the university to the outside world, from their courses to alumni who've already graduated, and so on. So all of those petals in the connected curriculum are aspects of that. I'm just going to concentrate on one of them, of connecting students with researchers and research at University College, because they've come because it's known for its research. They need to have a lot of good contact on that. So web pages which are showing staff research profiles, having public-facing videos which students can watch, which are engaging and interesting about the kind of research going on. Researchers and students both using research blogs to blog about what they're doing. Bringing MOOCs into the university has been an important way of bringing research academics to teaching. We had an internal competition offering funding to help academics develop MOOCs. And the great majority of the people who applied for this funding were researchers who didn't really do any teaching at all, but they saw the opportunity of getting their research ideas out to more people. So the critical actions within UCL have been to try and engage all departments in thinking about and planning for MOOCs, and creating a digital platform where student and staff research can come together. So they have dialogues and blogs and representations and questions and so on. So just one example of how MOOCs have made a difference, a MOOC on dementia is bringing the research results on dementia, which is being researched by a lot of people at UCL. This is the way it's represented on the FutureLearn platform. So you have a number of 4 weeks and a number of activities in each week. And a typical step in an activity will look like this, where they have a video animation explaining, for example, in this case, behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, so that both professionals and families and sufferers can all pile in and look at this kind of work. So getting people to understand what's going on in the field through this kind of process can be very helpful. So you get video representations of new approaches and methods in the field, whatever that field happens to be, and discussion and debate with their peers. Professionals debating, that's an interesting approach to understanding behavioral frontotemporal dementia, never seen that before. Lots of discussions coming in on how we can make use of this. Our most recent MOOC to run was on perioperative medicine, which is another area where the research at University College is world class. Perioperative medicine is something that needs to be understood in every single clinical context in the entire world. So we've got tens of thousands of people in there already, and a much higher level of taking up the certificate than is normal with MOOCs, because there are so many professionals who need to know this. So that way of mixing up research and teaching is incredibly powerful. And that, I think, is why one of the reasons why the researchers are coming in. Unfortunately, the researcher who did this has now been pinched by another organization for doing communication about research, which is most unfortunate, but that's the kind of thing that happens when you do these things. Another angle is to look at how we support the teachers in doing research on discovering how we do all this new way of teaching. And the learning designer came out of a research project on looking at how we could help teachers think of themselves as designers, experimental designers. So this shows the design screen of the learning designer, where you're creating your learning design as a kind of digital object. At the top, there is some basic information about the module or lesson or session or chunk of learning that you're trying to do, its objectives, its course, topic, and number of students you've got, and so on. And down here are the descriptions of how you're going to run that session. And you might begin with some homework for them to do in advance, and then run a class session, then do a field trip, and then come back to a class session, and so on. It could be that kind of thing. But as you design, you're given a bit of help. So you're prompted to consider 6 different types of learning activity. And this is all in a book that I wrote some time ago, and invites you to think about what kind of learning you're getting your students to do. Is it learning through acquisition? They're just reading, watching, or listening. Is it something more active, like learning through inquiry, through discussion, through practice, through collaboration, or through production? And those 6 seem to do the job more or less of defining any of the kinds of things that we might do. There's a lot that you insert into practice, of course, and lots of different ways of doing discussion, but broadly speaking, people have been able to manage with those. We've managed with 6 categories of Bloom's taxonomy for 50 years or more, so I think we can manage with 6 different learning types. Now, the advantage of that is you're defining, as you go, what kind of learning your students are doing. You also have to specify how long each of those activities lasts for. Is this 10 minutes or half an hour or 5 minutes or whatever? And that is then giving you feedback in the form of a pie chart, which calculates what proportion of the sort of turquoisey blue is learning through acquisition, the yellow bit is learning through collaboration, the blue bit is learning through discussion. And maybe I think, well, I don't think I've got a very high proportion of learning through discussion. I've got to get the students discussing more. So I'm going to put in an additional discussion activity here. So as you see, what happens is I've put in that discussion activity. If I flip between those, I put in a 20-minute discussion activity, so that's changed the pie chart. If I take it out, the discussion activity is a much smaller sliver. If I put it in, it becomes a larger proportion. So that's the feedback you're getting as you progress through. And what we've seen is that when academics use this in workshops, they get an awful lot of the acquisition learning and a little bit of discussion, and they end up with a very boring-looking pie chart. And then they want to go back and think, well, maybe I should have some more active learning in there. And they start thinking about the redesign. So it has that interesting effect, that immediate feedback for all of us has that immediate effect of maybe there's something else I could do here. So if nothing else, if it just gets people to think about how you might get your students thinking differently, then it will have some effect. So the idea of something like tools, these design tools like the Learning Designer, of bringing teaching closer to research means that teaching becomes more like a design science. We can't expect to get it right first time. It's like anything else. We've got to try it out, take notice of what happens, and have another go. So it's bringing it closer to being more like an experimental process. And especially it supports the academics who are most focused on research don't have time to think about technology, in giving them some support in how they might think about how they do their teaching and how they bring technology into it. And that's how we might become more able to adapt to the demands of the economy. So now turning our focus to the external, and I hope as I'm whizzing through this, you might take note of some questions and issues which are coming up for you, because it's very important that we address those at the end. But thinking about the demands of the economy then, we've got to become more productive in the way that we produce students who go into the workplace. And that's because we're constantly being asked to do more with less. We're constantly being asked to increase the number of students in higher education, to get them to a higher level of attainment, and with a whole slew of new kinds of skills, especially digital skills. And in our economy, it's the digital skills which are most lacking. And I don't know if it's the same for Singapore, but within the UK, we need digital skills at every kind of job level. Whatever kind of job people are doing now, they've got to be able to work with technology. So it's very important that we understand for our students in the kinds of professional fields they're going into, how are they going to be able to work with that? So being able to change what we teach, as well as how we teach, alongside teaching every day and researching every day anyway, is a huge demand. And in order to manage that process, we've got to be more like a research community as teachers. So another way of using the learning designer is to think of it that way, as enabling teachers to be like a research community. So just as in research, we're learning how to build up our knowledge of how to do all this. So we're reducing that task of innovation. So here are some of the designs which people have already done. So we might look through those, we might browse through them in terms of what kind of pedagogy they're offering, or what kind of topic they're working on, and select what we think is an appropriate pedagogic design that I could use in my teaching. So that I'm not starting from scratch, I'm looking at something that somebody else has done, the kind of technology they've used, the kind of learning outcome they're trying to get to, or whatever. And then having selected it, and this one is about explaining a complex concept, and the context is blood pressure. And so this is a sequence of activities which the student goes through and works with a model of blood pressure and starts manipulating that model to try and understand it. So that's the kind of thing that I might need when I'm going to do my topic in the context of business education, let's say. So I have to adapt that text to fit the topic. And instead of being about blood pressure, this is going to be about cash flow, let's say. I'm going to use a different kind of resource, and this is going to be a digital model of business planning, let's say. But all of the pedagogy is very similar, because I'm getting students to go through an article, look at a video, work among themselves to prepare something, describe what the concept is, then use the resource to try and improve what they've done and so on, and work together collaboratively and individually. The pedagogy can all be the same, but the particular focus is what's different. So improving the pedagogy for my students and then testing it with them means I've now got something new. And so just as in the context of research, you're looking at what other people have done, you're building on what they've done, adapting it, experimenting with it, and then submitting for review. And you submit it into the index of where all the designs are. And this is what the review looks like. So we've set 4 criteria for what a good learning design looks like. I'll just give you an example of 2 of them. One is there should be some kind of test so that the teacher can test whether the outcomes are met. And in this case, the person has said, there's no produced activity here, so the only way the teacher can test is by reading the discussion forum, for example, and then they make a suggestion of something else you could do in order to have a produced activity in there. So it's just like getting feedback from a review on a journal article. They make some complaint about something you haven't done, and they suggest something that you might do instead. And with the good use of technology, so that's another criterion, and this person says the description of the forum is well set up and makes good use of the students' makes sure that the students do contribute. So that's a way of giving some kind of feedback which is positive to people. So it can work in exactly the same way as the review process in the context of journal articles. You're using the feedback, you resubmit, and then you've contributed to that larger community. So the whole idea of this is that we enable teachers to build that knowledge together, because we've got this huge burden of innovation, of all the things that digital technology can do, and all of the new skills that we've got to teach our students. So unless we're working together, rather like the research community works together to build knowledge of how on earth to do this, then we're going to fail to take the opportunities that we could be taking. So that process of building on the work of others, selecting a good pedagogic design, adapting the text and so on, is pretty similar to what we do in the context of research. You build on the work of others, you select a good experimental design, you adapt it to fit your context, you use appropriate resources and so on. That's what we do in research. So why shouldn't teaching as a process of design and experimentation look more like research? And that means that teachers really must be allowed and enabled to be able to act like design scientists, to use digital technology to enable more students to succeed, the kinds of things I was talking about at the start, to discover and share this new pedagogic knowledge by experimenting, building on the work of others, and then to contribute back to that same community, just as we do in the context of science. Because teaching has become much, much more difficult, much, much more ambitious, and much harder to do. So unless we work together on it, I don't think we'll be able to seize those opportunities that we could be doing. And finally, achieving genuine, inclusive prosperity. Now that's an area where I think we have to play our part in higher education. There's a lot of research on prosperity and growth and the differentials between communities and diversity and so on. There's a lot of research that academics already contribute in this area, but practically speaking, when we think of the tasks ahead of us in educating the world, there's an awfully long way to go. What more can we do to help that? And I want to just briefly outline 2 current new projects. One is on learning at scale in the Global South. And this is about assessing models for scaling up access to primary, secondary, and higher education. And this is a digital learning for development project which is funded by international development organizations. Secondly, the Relief Project, which is a new project at UCL, interdisciplinary and cross-continental, funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. And this is about educating the extraordinary number of refugees there are now in the world, 65 million people. And among those 65 million people, there will be many adults who could be contributing to the world and are unable to, who need professional development. There are many young people who've been unable to complete their education, could be going to university but now cannot, and many children who've had no schooling for many years. So the educational challenge is enormous there. And one of the things that we're looking at in the Relief Project is whether we can use MOOCs to alleviate that process. Sounds extraordinary, but I'm going to try and explain how. So just looking at these challenging figures, there is a moral imperative for higher education to help meet the global demand for higher education, and it's enormous. One estimate, by 2025, the global demand will double to 200 million per year, mostly from the emerging economies. Now, that's an old estimate, and these estimates tend, as time goes on, to get larger, so it's probably even worse than that by now. And that's an enormous number. School education, the most recent UNESCO estimates, that there are 263 million children and youth who are out of school, and that means the number of teachers we need by 2030 is some 68 million teachers. So that's going to be a hard task for higher education, to develop 68 million teachers in that period of time. Professional development, I've already alluded to the problems of professional development. 85% of the hard-to-fill jobs in the UK are due to lack of digital skills. So in the UK, we've got a huge task ahead of us. I'm sure that Singapore is further ahead. You've had an ICT master plan repeatedly updated over many years. You must be better off than we are, but it's still going to be a continuing and ever-increasing task. And what have we got to deal with that? We've got a conventional model of a 1 to 25 staff-student ratio in higher education. It's less in some places. In research universities, it's a lot less than 25. In other places, it's a lot more, but it's somewhere around that sort of value. That's how we think of higher education. That's what we do. Divide 25 into 68 million, you get something like 2.5 million new academics to try and develop those 68 million teachers. That's an awful lot of people. So there's something wrong with the model. So let me quickly explain how we might go from the conventional model, which at the moment is selective and fee-paying, and therefore small numbers, and therefore we get away with our low-cost VLEs. That's sufficient because we've just got small numbers of students. We have also tutor feedback and assessment, and so we can offer a formal award. And that means that most students complete, and that's a good model. That is a good model. That's worked very well. But it's small numbers. So how do we get the big numbers? Well, how we've done that is to have them open and free, and then we get the large numbers. But that means we have a high-cost platform, and the MOOC platforms have all cost multiple millions to develop. We have to have peer and automated feedback and assessment because we can't provide the manpower to do the assessment. And there's no formal award, therefore. What that means is that very few complete, and that's not a good model. So we can't use that model. Could we operate something like a MOOC freemium model? So this is some of the way in which we're thinking about this now. Suppose instead of free, we have a paid-for certificate. That will reduce the numbers from large, but there'll still be a reasonable number in there. We have peer automated plus some tutor assessment because we now have some fee paying to pay for the tutor assessment, and that means there can at least be some kind of certification. And that means that more people will complete. Will that be sufficient? Will that be sufficient for us to achieve that greater inclusion we look for? That's one of the ways we're trying to approach that. So inclusive education in the context of the Relief Project, then, would look at something like having a MOOC with 10,000 professional participants in it. So let's say that we're trying to do something like help people understand how to do waste management better in refugee settlements. And you're getting those ideas out to a lot of people in a lot of places. But there's only a smallish number of people who can possibly learn through the MOOC pedagogy, which is really only for professionals. I wouldn't expect that anybody other than professionals who've been educated at university could manage that. But each of those individuals now has the means to educate their own local group of maybe 25 people, using the resources of the MOOC And that multiplies up to now 250,000 people who've been able to be educated through that process in new techniques for waste management in local places. So that's one of the ways in which we might think about that cascade model actually getting to more people than would otherwise have been possible. Then the other way we can use it is to admit that we don't know that much about what you really need to do on waste management. We've got some studies, we've got a lot of research on this, but maybe that doesn't work in every context. So now we can think about the MOOC being a research tool for engaging community researchers. So you begin with that 10,000 local participants. Each one of those is then working with local users in a community research context and feeding back some of that information about how well things work, which then informs the research itself, and those ideas then get built into the next MOOC. So you have an iterative building of community knowledge about how to do waste management or hygiene or health or anything else, or rebuilding when they go back to their host communities. Now, those numbers aren't unrealistic. We're at 10,000 people in MOOCs. That's quite normal. 25 people for each of those individuals, that's quite normal. The arithmetic is fine. Making it happen is something else, and that's what the research project has to actually try and contend with. But the blended learning essentials that we ran last year for people in vocational education, this was for teachers, to enable them to learn more about blended learning. We had over 20,000 active teachers over the last year in that. This is not people registered, there were over 45,000 were registered. Like all MOOCs, half of that number actually are active, but that's 20,000 people. Each of those, is not unreasonable to think of them engaging with 25 students at the other end. So the numbers could work as long as we don't expect the MOOCs to get straight to the children who need to be educated, but to their parents to help them help their children learn to read, or to help them help their children with basic number and arithmetic. Maybe that could work. And this is how we get those people in the MOOCs to contribute back. So if we want to hear back how well that waste management worked, we ask them in our case, well, contribute your ideas for how you best use a VLE, and that's how you could get the professionals coming back. Pin on that digital board your idea, your experience, your photo of how well this worked in practice. So that moral imperative, I think, remains with us, that we have to take responsibility for this in higher education. How do we do it? Using all of those different kinds of digital technologies, being inventive, being exploratory, being experimental with how we might use digital technologies to do it. So I think there is a positive role for higher education in our digital world. And I've talked about meeting the threats. I don't think the private sector has got it yet, but they will in due course at some point. So we have to be sure that we as teachers are experimenting in the kinds of way that I've suggested, but we can't do it on our own. We've got to do it in a context of institutional leadership and government policy that's oriented towards understanding what digital can do, understands its value and potential, and understands the need for investment. Now, I think in Singapore, you have the extraordinary advantage that your government does understand this, and your institution does understand these things. So there is a way in which you'll be moving forward to meet those threats, and therefore optimize the opportunities. But that's going to depend on this culture of innovation as well. And that's a different way of thinking about teaching in higher education, that we're sharing, that we're co-designing, that we have a model of academic scholarship that applies to teaching in the way that we currently do it with research. So that's the argument. We have many, many different ways in which digital technology can take us forward in this digital world. I've just picked out some tiny examples of ways in which we can do this. And I think, as I said, that all of this means that we are doing the most important thing, because education is critical for building a better world. I'm sure we agree on that. I believe that digital technology is the means by which we can do this on a larger scale. And I've given examples of individual learning, which can help, self-regulated learning, helping the learner understand how they can work better, enabling teachers to build on each other's work, and therefore operate much more as a very productive system, which can reach more without having commensurate resources being put into it. So we've got an interesting future ahead of us. And if we can together see the ways in which we can take advantage of all of those opportunities it offers us, then we really will make a huge contribution to individuals, to knowledge, to the economy, and to society. Thank you. And what I'm most interested in now, of course, is to hear from you about your thoughts. Should we have a quick buzz session or go straight into it? Yeah? Yes, I'm fine. Yes, okay. So there's been a lot in that and a lot to process. So I'm going to suggest that we have a quick buzz session. Talk to the person next to you about the things that you felt were viable and interesting and you could go ahead with, and the things that you felt are really just impossible or not workable or don't really make sense in my context. What do you feel about what we could be doing as higher education in a digital world? So just 3 minutes, just talking to each other about your impressions immediately. Then we'll have the Q&A. Okay. Before you generate too many questions which are going to be much too difficult to address, I think we better stop this energetic discussion. Not possible to stop it now. What have I done? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try and stop education, which is not what one should do, and we've got the class buzzing. But let me just intervene here very briefly, because we want to have what I hope will be a very lively question and answer session. But before I do that, let me first thank Diana for a wonderfully illuminating lecture. I'm not going to do a commentary or response to the lecture, but I just want to make a couple of very brief points So just listening to that, there were 3 don'ts and 3 do's that I picked up from it. And I just want to mention them and see if you share the same things. So first of all, don't chase fads, right? Just because there's a new technology out there, let's not feel obliged to use it. Second don't is don't reinvent the wheel. If the technology is out there, if there are colleagues who have done it, borrow. And the third don't was don't fear the unknown. Often we're afraid this may not work, and so we prefer not to do it, or we then say, no, what we did 10 years ago works better. So those are the 3 don'ts. What are the 3 do's? Well, be adaptive, adapt to the future. Be collaborative, and I think that's very important. Work together as a team. We often forget that we are part of a team, we're part of a system delivering this education. And the third do is be scientific. And I think that's an important thing also in terms of how we design our education and how we deliver it. Having said all of that, and I cannot help but say this, Diana referenced many times to the pre-internet days, 20, 25 years ago. And when I entered this place, there were a few cryptic comments about my sartorial choice for today. And that was deliberate. So this jacket that you see me wearing is the traditional academic tweed jacket. So I'm trying to anchor the past to the future. And it's also a jacket that's about 25 years old. So it is the pre-internet jacket. It is not the Internet of Things. But we're now today in the Internet of Things, and we want to look to the future rather than to the past. So let me now open the Q&A session. There are microphones on either aisles, and also Vic has a freestanding mic, and there's another one here that I will hand out. So just raise your hands, and we'll come to you. So again, if you have a question, just identify yourself, ask a question, or if you have a comment, make a comment. In view of the large number of people here, do try to be concise so Diana will have time to respond to as many people as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Diana, thank you very much for the very insightful lecture. I'm very particularly interested in your first topic on helping individuals to reach their learning potential by personalized learning. You talk about the various groups of people that could benefit from various methods of personalized learning. But within each group, say for example in the more advanced students, each of them will probably learn in a different style. So how would you use technology to cater and understand their learning style so that you could optimize their learning potential? It could apply similarly to individuals with core disabilities or individuals where the system fails. So how do we actually customize technology in such a way that would truly recognize their learning styles at the same time optimize the learning for each of them?
That's a very interesting question that touches a raw nerve in a way, because the idea of learning styles, that we each have a particular learning style, I think is unhelpful. And I think it's unhelpful because the point of education is to take you beyond what you can do naturally for yourself. And if we have students who, for example, have a style where they like to read everything first and think about it and then do something, and another student who wants to plunge in and try something out and then read about it, fine. But they should both explore the alternative style. Maybe they've, for whatever reason, for the way in which their prior education has channeled them, they might have just come up with a particular notion of a preference. And it's our job, I think, to take them beyond those. So the most important thing to do is to provide that variety of different kinds of ways of learning, make them be collaborative sometimes. They don't want to be, but they're going to have to be in the workplace and in their future life. So you've got to learn how to do that, even if you don't like it. Sometimes they'll find they get quite a lot out of it, and that's our job to make sure that they do. So I think there's a premise, there's a statement behind the question that says, following their style is a good thing. And I certainly think that enabling them to go beyond what we can do with everybody is important. And finding out where they're lacking, as for having certain kinds of disabilities, is important. But trying to use the technology to tailor their preference, no, I would resist that, actually, if anything. Thank you. Nice question, though. And school teachers have been hoodwinked in that sort of way as well, I think. You know, they actually believe in some of these things. It's a shame.
I just have a question. I'm a learning designer. I work with faculty members designing learning solutions. But one of the things I've noticed is that in higher education, especially university, many of them are attending video lectures. They don't attend lectures face-to-face. They stay at home and view the lectures, right? And I'm sure in NUS, many of the classes are like that. But the problem now I find is that professors are just okay with just putting their lectures online. Instead of designing real pedagogy with full interactive e-learning kind of methodology, they are just content with just putting the videos online, the lectures. And I try to work with some faculty members in trying to design a pure, more interactive e-learning solutions, you know. But their take is that don't make any changes to my lecture notes. Right? Keep my lecture notes as it is. This is how I teach as it is, right? I just put my lecture notes online and I just video me, right? So I don't know whether any of you have the same problem, but I said, okay, if that's what you want, and this is how you want to do your lectures. I mean, I'm providing a service, so as much as a suggested pedagogy, you want to change, you want to keep as it is. But I do find quite a few of them, not every one of them, but quite a few of the faculties are as such. So how do you mitigate that?
Well, how you mitigate it is quite tricky. I mean, I don't know if data would help, but one of the big problems with putting your lecture online is your lecture is usually something like 45, 50 minutes or something like that. Nobody ever watches a video online for 45 or 50 minutes. I mean, how many people in this room have watched an educational video for that long? I mean, maybe a film or something, but you don't watch things. You know, a laptop is a sit-forward environment. It's not a sit-back environment. You don't sit back and watch that lecture, that talking head, for that long. They do it in the lecture theatre because they are literally a captive audience, and so they will sit there for the 50 minutes, as I'm grateful you have done. But on your laptop at home in your study bedroom with all those thousands of other interesting things on there to do, no way. So the way that we craft those videos for learning on your own at home has to be different anyway. It has to be much shorter, maximum 10 minutes, absolute max, and then you can be sure that they're probably going to be switching off after about 6. So we've got to think about it in a very different way. And also, when you're expecting that they've done something offline at home, that when they come to the classroom, they've benefited from that in such a way that they can now do something with that new knowledge. So you've got to test that, make sure that that's part of that process of asking them to do those things at home. The revision video is very useful, and it's important for students to be able to do that. But don't expect that students are disciplined enough to be able to just park your lecture online. And you've got to show them the stats on that. Maybe that would convince them, I don't know. But that's a derogation of responsibility to say that I can just put my lecture online and expect them to get it, because they won't. We will fail them if we do that. So maybe that's a cultural thing, and we have to make sure that people have that debate, understand it, understand the way other academics think of it, because nobody can defend that position. And if you have to try and sit in a room with your fellow academics and defend it, I don't think you could. Could you? I don't think so. It's not something we can make rules about. And if you try to give academics rules to work to, and they say, okay, nobody can do this and everybody's got to do this, it won't work at all. I mean, we're a rebellious lot, and that won't happen at all. But the culture should be there.
If you could just introduce yourself and
Sure.
where you're from.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Diana. I'm Hui Ting from the Department of Pharmacy and an instructor. So I think there are no debates and qualms about digital technology improving teaching efficiency. definitely will help. But I was going to ask your advice, perhaps. Would increasing teaching efficiency necessarily mean increasing teaching effectiveness? And if not, what would your advice be to new teachers like us when we are choosing a certain platform or technology to use in class? How do I balance using that to teach efficiently versus teaching effectively? Or what are considerations that I should take into mind when I want to use them in the class? Thank you.
Well, you'll be very aware that efficiency is a ratio between input and output. And in teaching more effectively, the most important thing is that the output, i.e. the student achievement, is improved. And we may be able to get higher achievement with a bit more effort by ourselves, or even with less effort by ourselves, if we use that productivity available to us through technology effectively enough. So the most important thing is to be able to understand what the students are getting out of it. And that's a matter of assessment, formative assessment, summative assessment. What I described in the Learning Designer as the produce activities. So whenever students are producing something that you can use as evidence of how well they're understanding, then that's an opportunity for us to judge effectiveness. So you've got to have that, at least at your disposal. And digital technologies give us that opportunity much better than old technologies ever did. We can just go and look at a few comments on a forum and begin to see how the discussion is going in the wrong direction, or somebody's got the wrong end of the stick or something, and then you know something about the effectiveness and you can improve on that. Or you can give a series of, you can track their engagement with the platform. You can see that it drops right down here in this week and say, what are we going to do about that? We saw that in one of our MOOCs recently, that we saw a big drop in activity for one step. And that was because it was a much harder activity and all the teachers couldn't give the time to doing that. So we ended up by rebalancing that over far more sessions, so that they had time to build up to it, and then there was far more engagement with that activity when they came to it. So we'd sort of stretched out the activity a bit. So there's all those ways in which, in order to be sure that we're being more effective, we make sure we know the evidence of that. And we use the digital technology to do that. But making it more effective, more efficient in terms of reducing our own workload is a very important thing for us and the university administration to understand, because we're changing so many things, and digital changes the workload distribution for academics. So whereas if you're teaching entirely conventionally, you can do a bit of preparation beforehand and go in and deal with the problems in the lecture or whatever. When you're trying to do something online, you've got to think through the kinds of problems that people are going to have and prepare the activities and do that all up front. So that brings the workload up front. And then you hope that you can amortize that over large numbers of students and just tweak it a bit in successive years, so you benefit from that in the longer term. But it's likely to be in the longer term. So any budgetary process which works on an annual one-off basis is not going to work in this new context that we have. So we've got to get people understanding the notion of investing in order for that greater payoff of efficiency in the longer run. Unfortunately, most university systems don't understand this at all. Perhaps I should have attended to some of that too, because it's a very important practical effect. And we have another tool for it. It's called the Course Resource Appraisal Model. And what you do is you work out how much of each activity students are going to be spending their time on, how much it's going to cost you in terms of your time to produce that activity, first time off, and then to tweak it for the second time around, and then run it in perpetuity with just a bit of tweaking. And you get very interesting results. You get a huge workload up front, and then it drops a lot in the later years. But unless you've got that upfront investment, you don't get that payoff. And the payoff comes, but in years 2 and 3. University systems don't understand that. So your question is very important. Efficiency, productivity, absolutely right. We've got to be better at how we enable students to learn more effectively. But we've also got to be careful of our own workload and time, and that means that managers and administrators in universities have got to understand that redistribution of effort. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, but the effectiveness part, that's evidence. So we have to collect it. Okay.
Hello, thank you. My name is Prof from Civil Engineering.
Mm-hmm.
It's a question generally for NUS. We have measured modules in terms of modular credits, 2 MCs, 4 MCs. And then in our system, we will sort of equate that to how many hours of lectures and tutorials and everything. But with blended learning and active learning, I feel that system is a bit traditional because nowadays the students have to watch 4 or 5 online lectures, YouTube videos and all this, and still come to the classroom for 2 hours. And I have cases where students come at 12 to 2, they have a tutorial beforehand, basically they haven't had lunch until 2 o'clock after 2. So I wonder if NUS or UCL, you have a way to measure active learning by the number of hours students spend online learning, watching videos and all this, and then reduce the in-class learning because it actually takes up a lot of time for the students. That they don't really have time. Most of the students just say they don't have time to watch it. Yeah, that's my question.
Yes, but that requires an understanding of how much learning time it takes to do this level of study. It's a conversation we had yesterday, actually, several times, because we have a difficulty in higher education. Are you talking about undergraduate or postgraduate? No, undergraduate. And one of the first things students have to understand is how much time it takes to study at degree level. Now, we all have measures, and I'm sure you have the same kinds of measures here. We have so many credit modules means so many hours of study. So we have 30 credit modules at UCL at master's level. That means 300 hours of study. To do a master's degree takes 1,800 hours. To do an undergraduate degree takes 1,200 hours a year, and then you have 3 times. So we have metrics for how much study time students have. And that study time is partly class time and partly self-regulated learning. And what I think students are not understanding is that by asking them to look at that lecture in advance of the class, we are taking some of that self-regulated learning time and saying, here's a way you can use that productively. So that is part of their expected study time for studying at university level. There's no 2 ways around that. And one of the difficulties is, I think, that students have tended to think that all of what we class as self-regulated learning, and at master's level, that's something like 200 hours in a term. It's a ridiculous number. Nobody does that. But if we start to use that time and say, do this kind of preparation, read these things, do this project, come and report in the lecture time, they think it's extra work. It's not extra work. That's the amount of time you should be spending. We're helping you spend it. Now, does that make sense?
Yes and no. I think then I guess it's also the way we transition to blended learning. So if you move some of their lectures to online, then there's no reason for students to come spend 2 hours and listen to you talk
That's
again.
A different argument.
The same material again.
No, but they shouldn't be seeing the same material again.
Yeah.
The whole point of getting to look at it in advance is you can now do something in class that you couldn't do otherwise. So that is different. But I think the argument about how much time it takes to study is a very important cultural issue that students have to understand. And we are not giving them extra work. We are helping them do the work they should be doing anyway.
One and then 2. For the rest of you, if you want to sort of get in the queue, you can stick your hands up and I'll try and remember where you are and make sure you get your say before we close for the day. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan from Business School, and in response to that earlier point about having to spend 2 hours in a blended learning module in class, I think it's a matter of sometimes design. The instructor has to design it into the blended learning mode to make sure that students actually would have achieved small little successes, like what you mentioned earlier, through the videos and then to build on those little successes in class. All right, and those little successes can then be tracked digitally through the system, so that for the instructors to actually see before they actually come to class and to facilitate the discussion accordingly. So that would then help in terms of teaching efficacy as well, and that will help reduce the class hours. Thank you.
That's a great idea. Could you just tell us something about how you do that? An example of those small successes. What do they look like? How do you see
Those small little successes can be, for example, the weekly assessments. It just takes about 3 to 5 questions that you post online with regards to the videos, right, and tests whether they have genuinely seen the videos. And you could be testing at, for example, Bloom's Taxonomy level 2 or 3. And then in class, you come to build on Bloom's Taxonomy levels 4 to 6, for example. And that would then help you achieve both efficiency and efficacy.
Yeah, so that's a very nice example of being able to use an automated formative assessment process linked to a video to judge the extent to which the students have got that point. So that's a produce activity, following on from an acquisition activity, and enables the teacher to track how well students are doing it. And then in class, you can address some of the difficulties that you see there as well. And that's, I mean, you're designing that very well. It's not just saying, just watch this lecture. You're doing something with the lecture, in other words, and that's a very important way to do it. But again, you're not encroaching on their learning time. I mean, it's not additional learning time, is it?
No, that's not additional learning
No.
time. It's basically how you design it. So
Yeah.
the earlier point about being scientific in designing it, collecting the data to inform your design.
You have the microphone.
Yeah, it's about being scientific in the design and collecting data to inform your design,
Yes.
and you develop along the way.
Yeah.
So on a weekly basis as an instructor, what you should do is then to look at your own data, your own online learning data, and inform yourself as to how you should then move on to facilitate each week's class. Yeah.
That's great. So having these kinds of exchanges about good ideas for ways of teaching and organizing teaching is the kind of communication among scholars which allows us to progress that knowledge, to improve on each other's work. So if you were to share that learning design with your colleagues, and everybody could then take that and then move beyond that, share that back, then we'd really make progress. That's great.
Diana, I'd like you to help me resolve a worry I have about teaching-research linkage. I'm all for the teaching-research connection. I think, yes, we ought to be much more research-informed in the way we teach and bring our research enterprise within our teaching enterprise and so forth. I've heard many times in different contexts now the way people analogize the teaching enterprise using a research framing. I'm worried because, while I understand it, I'm worried because within a research-intensive university, where the two enterprises are often quite separate and they are often differential in the way they are valued. I find myself worrying about framing teaching or analogizing it using the research metaphor.
But why is it a worry, given your recognition that they're separate and research is valued more?
It's like the only way in which teaching can be elevated, it's only in the name of a research frame.
I see.
And
yes.
I would like to be able to value teaching for its very intrinsic value and not have to be like research.
Oh, I entirely accept that. And my reason for analogizing it with research was not in order to say, look, it's just as good as research, but to say, look, we've got a problem because teaching is so hard to do now. We've got a lot to learn. And as a community, we've got to learn. We've got to build that knowledge. It's just like being a researcher in that sense. And that means following that process of looking at what other people have done, building on that, experimenting, revising, testing until we think it works, and then offering it back to the community. Now, that's a very familiar process to academics. It's familiar because we use it in research, but we tend not to do it in teaching. We're all working on our own in teaching. It's a closed process. So, and teachers never read educational journals, you know, that's far too much to expect. So it's not going to happen that way. So what is the equivalent means by which we share and build on each other's work? And something like a simple learning design, which would take something like the one we just heard of, write it out, talk about how we ran it, how students appreciated what they got out of it, share it with others, and that's a good idea. You know, I'll take that and I'll build on it. So it's much more about how we manage this challenging problem that we have as teachers, of getting there, of doing the job we have to do in this digital world. It's hard enough that we've got to do it together. We can't carry on doing it separately. That's really the point. But I agree with you that research has the status that teaching doesn't. And it has that because of the value of research to the university. That's how it's judged. That's what all the league tables are about. And the research excellence framework that we have in the UK, that's what everybody focuses on. And you'd be crazy as a head of department to suggest that your staff spend their time thinking about and experimenting with their teaching rather than research, because your department will get less money as a result. It's as simple as that. So of course, research is elevated. We've now got an unfortunate exercise in the UK called the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is being devised by bureaucrats and politicians, which won't work at all. So we'll be in a worse mess. But you know, that aside, the effort to try to bring teaching into parity with research depends on how the funding flows. And for the reasons that I was just saying, it's flowing in all the wrong ways anyway to teaching. We don't see it as something that we invest in. So that's not going to work. But I'm sorry, I think you were going to come back on something there.
I think up to a point, the analogy is safe enough for me. Going through that steps about gathering data, being iterative, and so forth, I think that's fine. What I worry about is when the analogy is pushed all the way to the end, where the impact or evaluation of teaching is looked at within a frame of evaluation for research outcomes.
Yes.
I think that's not very valid at some level, and it's rather unreachable at another level. And plus the fact that the criteria are not the same. But
no,
at institutional level, the impact that you're expected to deliver on the teaching front sometimes is framed in that way, in the research way. So for example, the demand for publication.
No, it's not about publication at all.
Exactly.
And I wouldn't even
what I'm saying
push
is
it to,
that analogy can be pushed that
okay.
far, and that's the worry
fair
I
enough.
have.
No, I'm not interested in people writing journal papers. It's sharing their teaching designs is the important thing. And I'm not even sure that I would push that evaluation to citations of your teaching design, because that could, distort the whole process horribly. So it's much more about being able to demonstrate that your students appreciate, value, and get something out of it. That's the important bit. That's what it stands or falls by. So it would be different in that respect, I agree, yes. So it's a very important issue. How far do we take that analogy? And how do we raise the level of status of teaching? Yeah, absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Can I just add into that? Because the point that Hong Moon raises is a very valid one. And there's many ways of looking at this. But my own takeaway from your presentation was not that you were trying to draw the parallel between teaching and research as conventionally understood, but rather to approach teaching in a more scientific way, which is how the researchers approach their work. Yeah. And I think if you're looking at it from that perspective, then I think that's a pretty safe way of dealing with it, right? Because as you pointed out in your presentation, teaching today, higher education today, has become so complex that we need to find better ways of doing what we do intuitively, right? And that seems to me to be a good pathway to go. But I think what Hong Hoon is alluding to is that danger right? That there couldn't be conflation, and then that creates unrealistic expectations. Any other questions or comments? We have another 5 minutes or so, so if we can take maybe a couple more questions or observations. Anyone? Things that came out of your BuzzFeed, Johan?
My name is Johan. I'm from the Center for Development of Teaching and Learning. And so my question has to do with this idea of academic scholarship. So it kind of connects with the previous point as well. And the question is essentially, how do we incentivize colleagues to take this kind of scientific, scholarly approach to their teaching in the same way that they would, without questioning, take that approach to their research? So it's a question around recognition, around reward. In particular, if we don't want to push the analogy too far, which would be problematic, you know, publication can be a very high barrier for people. And publication, of course, has its own rewards as well. So what are your thoughts around building a culture of academic scholarship?
Yeah, it is. It's very much about recognition of the importance and value of what you've contributed. And we have some mechanisms for that. You have mechanisms for that here in NUS for recognizing teaching fellows. We have teaching fellows in the UK who are recognized on a national level or within an institution and so on. And that's one way of doing it. And you put together your portfolio, and so your portfolio would now consist of some of the contributions you've made to learning designs, for example. So it would extend the way in which the evidence for that kind of portfolio is offered. However, we still have the problem that being recognized even as a national teaching fellow is still not comparable with recognition as a researcher. We've still got that problem, especially within the research universities. And we are grappling now with problems of students not appreciating the kind of environment that they find at the university they come to. And that's about the way we do our teaching and caring for students, pastoral activities. So that's going to become more important, I think. And any contribution you can make to improving that will be recognized. But that's about all we've got, is just that teaching fellowship idea. And so far, that's the best we're ever going to get. What the Teaching Excellence Framework ever produces in terms of actual cash to departments that do well is a big question. I think the original idea of having tuition fees, as far as the Conservative government was concerned, was that this would create a market that would mean that you have to do well for your students, otherwise they won't come to you. They're like customers. However, as I said, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the education industry is and the way it operates. So that's just not going to work. We're not going to be able to see benefit from having more customers. It's not going to come that way. So it's got to come some other way. And it's up to the academic community to define what we mean. So I've gone some way to doing that. But I don't think I've got a definitive answer to that. We have to develop that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. Any final questions or comments before we draw the formal proceedings to a close? No? Okay, well then it just... Diana, anything that you'd like to say anymore?
No.
Any final closing remarks?
I just enjoyed the questions very much because I thought they were all absolutely spot on. They're all addressing exactly the kinds of problems that we have to try and figure out the answers to. And the more that we do it collectively, and as recognizing that culture of innovation and change, that it's now going to be good for us to work with, and we'll make even more of a contribution that way through the teaching contribution of universities, then I think it'll become enjoyable and exciting and not just a pressure. So that's the hope.
Thank you very much. Now, before we end, we have a small token of appreciation, which is in the real world and not in the digital world. So you can step up over there and we'll hand it to you.